Prior to Apollo 11, there were two basic theories of where the moon had come from. One of the theories was that the moon had come from the Earth, that as the Earth was spinning in its early state, perhaps it spun off the moon. This would, of course, mean that the moon was made of the same stuff that the Earth was made of and would essentially be made in the same way. The other theory was that the moon was sort of a bunch of celestial garbage, a bunch of debris from space that had been packed together like a giant snowball, and this, of course, would mean that the moon would be radically different than the Earth in its composition and the way it would respond to various experiments. So with Apollo 11, they decided to test these two theories and see which of the two theories was correct. They put a seismometer, sort of a listening device, on the surface of the moon, and when they were finished with the LEM, they rammed it back into the moon. Now, the idea was that if the moon came from the Earth, it would do what the Earth does under these circumstances. There'd be a thud as the moon was struck by the LEM, and then there'd be a boing as the sound wave ricocheted off the core of the moon. On the other hand, if the moon was sort of a bunch of celestial garbage that had been packed together, you'd get a thud, all right, but you wouldn't get any boing because there'd be no core down there to reflect the wave. So they were all very excited about this experiment, and they put the seismometer on the surface of the moon during Apollo 11, and they got back up, and they rammed the LEM back into the moon, and everybody was waiting very expectantly with their earphones to what the signal was going to say, and they heard the thud as it hit, and then they heard boing, 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 boing for some 24 minutes or thereabouts. That sound wave ricocheted around inside that moon. Now, of course, this wasn't supposed to happen. This was not one of the alternatives that was available, in the theory at least. So somebody said, well, we must have hit a funny rock, so we'll do it again. So when Apollo 12 came along, they put the seismometer in a different place. They hit the moon a little bit harder, and this time it rang for 34 minutes. Now, at this point, people began to wonder what was going on. Just recently, a meteorite struck near the Apollo 14 landing site, and the moon rang for 20-some-odd days. Now, of course, there are some explanations could be given here. Maybe the moon's hollow, somebody suggested. And somebody else said, well, if it's hollow, maybe there are people living inside it. So you can go about as far as you want there, I guess. Other people said, no, it's just like a big old Chinese gong hanging up there, and it's reverberating when it gets hit. Now, the point that I'm trying to impress you with is that even in such a simple thing as explaining where the moon came from, a lot of difficulty was run into, and experiments didn't work out. There weren't supposed to be any new properties for rocks on the moon. In my field of geology, for example, we have a measure of how easy it is to squeeze a rock called compressibility. And rocks have compressibilities like, well, 5.2, for instance, for granite, and 5.6, I think it is, for gabbro, and limestone's about 4.9, and so forth. All of the rocks on the Earth run about 4, 4.5, 5, 6, somewhere in that area. So it was thought, of course, that the moon rocks would be in that area, too. But you know almost every sample they've gotten has been about 1.8? You know what we have on the Earth that has a compressibility of about 1.8? Well, the best example I could give you would be cheddar cheese. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, I'm not suggesting that the moon is made out of cheese, but the point was that in this particular characteristic, the moon seemed to be more cheese-like than anything else. And the thing that I'm trying to point out to you here is that in such a simple question as where did the moon come from, we're having a great deal of difficulty. As a matter of fact, Urey, one of the more famous experimenters in this area, made the statement not too long ago that if we had to judge the existence of the moon on the plausibility of any of the theories of its origin, then we would have to say that the moon doesn't exist. In other words, it would be more reasonable to say there's no moon up there than to explain how it got there. Now, how reasonable is it for someone to sit back and say, I'm not going to believe in God because someday somebody may discover something? Obviously, the direction of research does not indicate that kind of solution is going to be found, and most atheists that are academically qualified in this area would readily concede this point. I believe we have overwhelming evidence that there is a God because when we ask the question, by what process initially was matter created from nothing, there is only one scientifically viable answer, and that is that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. But now let's turn our attention to a completely different argument, to a completely different set of criteria. In chart number 4 on page 3 of the booklet, there's a drawing of a very, very famous experiment. Stanley Miller received a Nobel Prize for this experiment. And the experiment demonstrates a principle that I think is exceedingly important in the areas that we're discussing. If I could prove to you that there is design in the creation, then you would have to admit there has to be a designer. Design does not happen by chance. If there is design, there had to be some kind of planning involved. The word design is a synonym for planning, and planning does not occur by chance. If there is design in the creation, if I can prove there is design in the creation, then there has to be a designer. Now, in one of our later lessons, we're going to spend a whole hour talking about design, because there's so many areas that you can show design in that it's really a topic all of its own. I just want to scratch the surface here. Just want to give you an example of the kind of evidence that can be given in this area. Now, Stanley Miller conducted an experiment that was monumental in biology, and I believe that he proved conclusively the necessity of there being a designer. The test tube you're looking at there in Chart 4 was filled with 4 primitive gases: methane, ammonia, water, and hydrogen. Methane's the stuff you heat your house with. Ammonia you're familiar with perhaps in refrigeration or laying fertilizer, scrubbing woodwork. It's a very unpleasant smelling material. And water and hydrogen. Now, these are non-living, non-directly related to living materials. They were put in the test tube. They were subjected to extensive electrical discharge for some 22 days or so. And in chart number 5, you see a result of the experiment. The amount of ammonia in the container is shown with the solid line, and it decreased as time went by. The dotted line shows the concentration of amino acid. It started out essentially at 0. And as the experiment progressed, the amount of amino acid became more and more concentrated. Now, pardon me for saying so, but for all intent and purposes, you were a walking blob of amino acids. Nothing personal. That's just what life is. Life is made up of properly arranged, properly distributed amino acids, arranged and formulated around various materials that can organize them. Now, when the newspapers picked this discovery up, the headlines read something like, "Scientist creates life." All right, have we created life from non-living, inorganic material? Now, the first thing we have to do in answering this question is to define what we mean by life. In Chart 6, you have a very crude sketch of materials related, at least, to what I'm going to call life. I'd like to emphasize here as we get into this discussion that just to define life is a monumental task, one that nobody has successfully done. Usually we do it in terms of various criteria. And from a very strict standpoint, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is not life. It does reproduce, but it does not respond to outside stimuli. It does not eat. It does not breathe. So really, in a strictly literal sense, it is not life. But let's assume it's life. How big a step is it from the material that Stanley Miller created in his test tube to the DNA molecule? Well, this is perhaps not an easy discussion. I think what we can do, though, is that we can work with some odds as far as the probabilities of producing some of the building blocks of the DNA. The DNA is made up of a number of individual little materials that have their own names, such things as purines, pyrimidines, and so forth. In the ancient hypothesized life soup of the early Earth, one of the materials that must have been present in abundance is the protein molecule. So just for sake of simplicity, let's figure the mathematical probabilities of getting a protein molecule by chance. What are the odds of this happening? Now, before I go any further, I'd like to express to you the point that this is not my calculation. I'm not qualified to make this calculation. The calculations that I'm going to present to you have been calculated by 3 very outstanding scientists. Dr. J.B. Lees is the head of the biology department at Oxford University in England, a nationally known biologist. Dr. Frank Allen is a graduate of Cornell University. He's chairman of the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Biological Science. Dr. Charles Eugene Guy is the head of the math department, University of Switzerland. These are outstanding men in their fields, and these are the calculations that these men have put together as to what the probabilities would be and the time required to produce a protein molecule from an amino acid by chance. Now, their calculations show that the mathematical probabilities of getting a protein molecule by chance is 1 out of 10 to the 160th power, and that the time that would be required would be something like 10 to the 243rd power years. Now let's get this in terms of something that's reasonable or something that you can understand more directly if you're not familiar with these numbers. In exercise 3, I've asked you to write out what 10 to the 43rd power is equal to. And I'd like for you to turn off the recorder and do this. What you'll need to do is to write a 1 down there, and then write, if you can get it in, 43 zeros to the right of that 1. Just do that. Put a 1 down there and write 43 zeros out to the right of the 1. All right, now that's 10 to the 43rd. Now the odds of getting a protein by chance is 1 out of 160, 10 to the 160th. Now we might give you an analogy here that might help you understand this a little bit better. Let's suppose that I had a deck of cards here, playing cards, 52 cards in a deck. And I shuffle them and I hold them out to you and I say, draw a card, any card. What are the odds of you getting the ace of spades? Well, it's 1 out of 52, isn't it? All right, now let's suppose that you were to put that card back in the deck after you drew the ace of spades and you were to draw it again. What would be the odds of getting it a second time? Well, if you know anything about statistics, you know that the way you calculate that is to multiply 1 out of 52 times 1 out of 52. Which would be roughly 1 out of 2,704. Let's suppose that you were to put that ace back in, and I shuffled them up, and you drew another ace of spades. 3 times in a row you drew an ace of spades. And then I put it back in, I shuffle them, and you draw it a 4th time. What would be the odds of drawing the ace of spades 4 times back to back out of a deck of cards? Well, 1 out of 52 times 1 out of 52 times 1 out of 52 times 1 out of 52. And that's roughly 1 out of 7,311,000 or something like that. Now, the point is that it could happen. It is possible. But in exercise 3, point number 2, the odds of getting a protein by chance would be 1 out of 10 to the 160th power. So you'd write a 1 with 160 zeros after it. That'd be like having a huge building, a huge gymnasium full of cards, all different, and having a tremendous explosion and somebody outside catching one of the cards on the way down and it being the ace of spades. The gentlemen that made these calculations tell us that the time required for this thing would be like 10 to the 243rd power years. You'd have to add 200 zeros to the right of the number that you wrote in blank 1. Now, just to make a little comparison, in blank number 4 of exercise 3, write out 10 to the 10th. That'd be 1 with 10 zeros written after it. Just do that real quick. Now that number is the maximum age for the Earth. I've never heard anybody that suggested that the Earth was that old. The universe maybe, but most people say the Earth that are using scientific chronology would say the Earth is like maybe, 4.5 billion or something like this, which would be 4.5 and then move the decimal 10 places to the right. Now, the point is that in dealing with this number, let's make a comparison between the number you have in blank 4 and the number in blank 3 or blank 1. Now remember that the odds that we're talking about here are the odds of getting a protein by chance from an amino acid. And when you look at those numbers, I think you recognize a very startling thing. And yet you don't really see the whole problem yet. Because the atheist, of course, will say, well, it could have happened the first instant of the creation. If there's any probability at all, it could have happened the first instant. That's right. It could have. But now what has to happen? You don't have life. You don't have DNA. All you've got is a protein. And protein-like materials make up the DNA. There's roughly 1,200 protein-like materials that make up the DNA. So essentially this molecule would have to sit under a rock for 10 to the 243rd power years until you got another one just like it. And then those two would have to sit there that long until you got a third and a fourth and a fifth until you had about 1,200 of them. And then if there happened to be a sugar phosphate matrix here, and if they happened to fall in the right place, and if they didn't get destroyed until the other ingredients of a living cell were produced, then you might have a living cell. In other words, you're so far from life when you get this one protein that it's not even worth talking about. Do you realize what this means? This demonstrates that you do not exist. I'm sorry, but you're not sitting in that chair. It is mathematically impossible for you to exist by chance. The Earth is simply not old enough. Not even for one of these things, much less 1,200 of them. Now, of course, if you admit that there's a designing force involved here, if you admit there's some guidance in the situation, then, of course, these statistics mean nothing. But if you admit there's a designing force, you've admitted there's a designer, and thus you've admitted there's a God. Now, I think we have to recognize, as we look at an argument of this kind, that all we're saying here is that when you have a choice of choosing between whether these sorts of things occur by chance or by design, chance is not a logical argument. And I want to emphasize again, we're not quoting some crackpot theologian off at in a dark corner someplace. These are outstanding scientists working in their field that are giving these statistics. Life could not have occurred by chance. It had to be designed. It had to be planned, even at the most primitive levels. And especially when you put this kind of argument together with what we did on the other side of this tape. It seems to me this is a very convincing evidence that there is a God. There is design in the creation, all kinds of design. We've just taken one very small example. And if there is design, there must be a designer. Now, so far, I hope you've noticed something. So far in our discussion, there has not been one single passage of Scripture quoted. We haven't referred to the Bible at all. And I think this is a very significant point. I think you need to recognize that there are reasons for this. I didn't come to believe in God because somebody taught me the Bible. Lord Kelvin once made the statement that if you study science deep enough and long enough, it will force you to believe in God. This is essentially what happened to me. I was forced, academically forced, to accept God's existence because of the kind of evidence that we've been considering. And actually, we've just scratched the surface in this area. But in our last evidence for the existence of God, I would like to take a look at the Bible, because we really haven't answered the question, which God? Why the God of the Bible? Why not the Hindu God? Or why not Buddha or some other God? Why the God of the Bible? Now, I'd like to suggest to you that if I could prove to you that the Bible is inspired, then you would have to admit there had to be something to inspire it. Inspiration does not occur by chance. Can we demonstrate that the Bible is inspired? I believe the answer to this question is yes. I believe we can offer convincing evidence that the Bible is inspired. Now, what I'd like for us to do in this discussion is to take a look at a couple of areas in which we can do this. We don't have very much time on this C60 cassette to do too much with this, but I'd like to just demonstrate a few areas and then leave it to you to do some more studying that perhaps will help you along these lines. Now, for example, in exercise 4, page 4, and carrying over to the next page, page 5 in the booklet, there's a list of scriptures. The first one's been spelled out for you. Leviticus 11, verse 37. There's a statement which indicates that the seed of a plant can be eaten safely, even if it's been in contact with a dead animal. This, of course, is in a series of scriptures in which Moses is giving health rules to the Israelites. Now, is that medically sound? Well, all of us recognize that. Certainly we all recognize the fact that bacterial contamination does not carry through seeds. Now, the point is that there's a great deal of material along this line contained in the Bible. We have a medical textbook that was written in Egypt around 1552 BC or thereabouts, called the Papyrus of Bears. The Papyrus of Bears is a medical textbook. It was written in Egypt by Egyptian doctors. And it really has some amazing cures in it. It has some interesting cosmetic cures. For instance, it tells the women that if they have got wrinkles, they can get rid of those wrinkles by rubbing a toad on the wrinkle. It tells them if their hair is turning gray, they can wash it in the blood of a black calf and it'll turn black. These are rather interesting cures, aren't they? There's a cure for baldness. It tells men that if you're getting bald, you could take a mixture of 6 fats, the hippopotamus, the crocodile, and so forth and so on, mix a donkey tooth crushed in honey, and put it on your head and it'll grow hair. Now, as one who doesn't have much hair, I can guarantee you that one doesn't work. The point is that there's a whole group of cures given in this book. They had some that weren't so funny, incidentally, too. For instance, they were told that if they had a cut, they could cure the cut by taking manure, especially the manure of a donkey, and smearing it in the cut. Can you imagine the kind of infections they must have gotten from that kind of practice? Now, the interesting thing is that Moses, who wrote the Torah, wrote the books of the Old Testament, was raised in Egypt. He was educated in Egypt. And I don't know of anybody who questions this. It's a historical fact. It's also a historical fact that Moses was born somewhere around 1500 to 1548 B.C. And therefore he was born just after the Papyrus of Bears was written. And undoubtedly he was schooled in this book. Did Moses make any of the same mistakes that the Egyptian doctors made? Did he regurgitate the knowledge of his day? Now, I'd like for you in Exercise 4 to look down through those scriptures, and you can take as little or as much time as you wish. You may want to turn the recorder off and make some notes as to what these scriptures are saying. And then I'd like to look at a few of them together and see what the point is that's being made. Now let's just pick and choose a few of these things. For instance, Leviticus, the 17th chapter, beginning with verse 11. You know, the Egyptians were the ones who began bloodletting. The belief was that man became ill because he had rotten blood, and so the way to get rid of the illness was naturally to drain out all the blood. What does Leviticus 17:11 and verse 14 say? For the life of the flesh is in the blood. The blood is the life of all flesh. Now, how do you know that? George Washington died because they bled him. Even in our country, not too many years ago, this was the accepted medical practice. How did Moses know this? That blood carries the essence of life, that it's important to life. Somebody says, well, it was luck. All right, let's take a look at another one. Genesis 3, verse 15. A statement made that woman possesses a seed. Do you know that in 1694, doctoral dissertations were written that expressed the belief that the male contained the baby complete in him, and all the woman served as was a glorified incubator? Stories from ancient Rome, babies out of the mud, Romulus and Remus. You may have read these things. The belief was in that time, and carried right on into the 17th century, that man possessed all that was necessary for life. Woman served no real purpose in the reproductive process except to provide an ideal environment where the seed could grow. And of course, the results of this were very bad. Woman was looked on as something to be possessed. She had no value. When a man died, they buried his wife or wives with him. Whether they were dead or not was immaterial. You talk about women's lib, boy, this was a real problem. And the interesting point here is that this kind of information is totally and diametrically opposed to what we read about in God's Word. Genesis 3, verse 15, God talking to Eve, and he says, of your seed, Eve. The first seed of a woman was photographed around 1922. How did Moses know that? In Leviticus 11, Moses listed as a group of animals as clean and unclean. Look through that carefully. And I believe you'll find that every single animal that Moses listed as unclean is an animal that carries a disease, a parasite, a worm that is very difficult to destroy by ordinary cooking. It would be dangerous to eat those animals without the sophisticated cooking procedures we have today. And the ones he listed as clean, we know, contained worms or parasites that are easily destroyed, if any. You could go out today and catch a bass in a lake near you there and pick that thing up, wiggling, and eat it raw. You're not used to doing that probably, but it wouldn't hurt you. You go out in that old pigsty, and you take a bite out of that old sow, and you're going to have to run for your life. And not only because of the fact that that sow may come after you, but also because of the fact that there's at least 10 or 15 diseases that you can get from that meat. Trichinosis, parasitosis, hookworm, tapeworm, and right on down the line. As you look through those verses that are listed there in Exercise 4, can't you see that Moses had to be the world's first microbiologist? There's an interesting book, None of These Diseases, by a medical doctor, S.I. McMillan, that you might want to get a hold of and pursue this more deeply. But I'd like to suggest to you that this is not just medicine that you find in the Bible along these lines. In Exercise 5, you find a listing of facts that demonstrate the astronomic accuracy of the Bible. And I'd suggest to you that you look very carefully at these. Job 26, verse 7, for example, demonstrates a statement in the Bible that is diametrically opposed to what was believed at Moses' time, and as a matter of fact, every other religion in existence had some totally wild and fallacious idea at that time. And actually, the origin of the book of Job was probably before Moses, but we won't get into that right here. Notice what it says. He hangeth the earth upon nothing. Thousands of years before the concept of gravitation and centrifugal force was understood. You go back and you read the Hindu writings, and you find that instead of this kind of explanation, that you have a concept of the earth on the back of 4 elephants, standing on a turtle, swimming in a sea of milk. Elephant scratches, you got an earthquake. Now, you can't fault these people because, after all, an elephant was the strongest thing they knew. The Greeks, in all their wisdom, had the earth on the back of a man named Atlas. And every time he swatted at a fly, the wind from his hand caused hurricanes and what have you. How did Job know this? How can this writing be there? Even such innocent statements as Luke 17, beginning with verse 34, where Christ is talking about his coming, and he says that some people are going to be in bed at night and some are going to be out in the field working, which is a daytime activity. The earth has to be around to allow that. It wasn't known, at least not universally known at the time in which that was written. Statement after statement after statement. Even Revelation 7, verse 1, which some people have pointed to as an inconsistency, is accurate. The earth does have four corners, not four corners like a sheet of paper, but it's pear-shaped and it does have highs, harmonic highs we call them. You can do the same thing in physical accuracy, in physical science. You'll notice, for example, that throughout those listings given there are statements that are totally and completely accurate with the day in which we live. Snow is clearly valuable. We know today that snow stores water that provides for irrigation of our crops. It's aesthetically beautiful. Water cycle, something that's only been discovered in recent times, Ecclesiastes. Jeremiah, totally contradictory to every other religion, every other concept of the day in which Jeremiah lived. You know what they used to believe about lightning? The gods were hot rodding around the heavens in their chariots, and when they got mad at somebody here on the earth, they threw a lightning bolt, blew them right off the earth. What does Jeremiah say? He maketh the lightning with the rain, or by the rain, or for the rain. All the individuals at that time had opportunity to look at lightning and draw conclusions. And they all assigned it to some supernatural manifestation of the gods. How is it that only Jeremiah accurately described the origin of lightning? I hope you'll look through these examples and notice that all of them are profound things. They're things that have been discovered in very recent times. And I think you'll recognize as you look at this that clearly this is not the writing of ancient ignorant men. And we've just scratched the surface here. There are literally hundreds of evidences that could be listed along this line. My suggestion to you is that there is evidence of the inspiration of the Bible. We just looked at the scientific evidence. You can do the same thing historically, literally, psychologically. You name the field, and people can show you evidence that this is not something that was based upon the traditions and the knowledge of ancient peoples in their ignorance. There is evidence of inspiration in the Bible. And if the Bible is inspired, there had to be an inspirer. Now would you in exercise 7 please write down the 3 evidences that you understand we have presented in this discussion, and then we'll summarize our discussion. I hope you listed in number 1 that if we apply scientific method to the question of the origin of matter, there's only one possible rational explanation: that a non-physical being, a God, was responsible for the creation. First cause. Number 2, there is design in nature. Design that could not possibly be attributed to chance, and if there is design, there has to be a designer. Number 3, the Bible shows inspiration. And if the Bible is inspired, there had to be something to inspire it. Do you believe in God? Write a yes or a no in the blank provided there. I sincerely hope the answer is yes. But if the answer is no, I hope that you'll allow me to study further with you by listening to some of the other tapes or by writing to me. My name is John Clayton. My address is 17411 Battles Road, B-A-T-T-L-E-S Road, South Bend, Indiana, 46614. I would welcome an opportunity to correspond with you. Thank you so much for taking time to study this material with me.